it's like there's false hard ceilings where they're just made of plaster. They're just made of of drywall, you know? And one step on them and you're right through them. It's hard to tell until you're actually up there really.
Hey everyone, welcome to another In the Trenches episode. Today is going to be an installation focus episode. Remember, on these videos, we cover the things you should be considering and thinking about in terms of installation of a physical security system. And so we've got our also awesome panel of experts here with us again today. Excited to dive into the topic of ceilings. Something we're always going to run into and usually installations involve, but something rarely covered or thought about. So I want to spend some time today with the team here and dive into ceilings. And we're going to start, I think, by talking about what kind of cameras would we typically mount to a ceiling. You guys think that's a good place to start?
Something really small and light.
That's good.
We'll get there.
No, absolutely. Okay, so that actually brings up a good
not
point.
the giant PTZ that weighs like 30 pounds.
Give it a go. See what happens.
That's right. That's
Make
right.
my
Actually,
day.
I think a better place to start, I stand corrected, I correct myself. I think a better place to start is actually ceiling types in general. Let's cover that first. Let's talk about the thing that you already have before we talk about the cameras that might go there.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a few types of ceilings that come to mind when I think about commercial structures. Exposed ceilings being probably the most common one that we run into. That's where you have your open like mechanical structures and all the utilities you can see above your head, so you can kind of know where to route your cabling and know what you're working with, not have to deal with something like a drop ceiling or a suspended ceiling where you have all your tiles and everything suspended from the ceiling. So you have your wiring and your mechanical in between the tiles and the floor above. Those are probably the two most common types, I would say, that we run into.
Would you say, Cal, that the open ceilings are easier typically for running your cable pathways, but present some additional challenges for where exactly and how exactly you mount your cameras? Whereas your closed ceiling that's got with ceiling tiles, it's a little easier to know, okay, here's where I'm mounting it, but there's some more complexities around the actual pathways.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you got to take into account whenever you're doing exposed ceilings is you got to make sure your work looks good, because it's, very easily inspected. When they walk on site, they can just look up and see all the work that you've done. So you can't make any, obvious mistakes there. You got to make sure
we have some photographs comparing some work from a recent job of ours and someone else's.
And we actually have a ceiling inspection going on right now at one of our job sites as we speak.
Like currently, actually, right. And so I just quickly want to make sure everyone's on the same page. An exposed ceiling type would be something you would see like if you walked into a Home Depot or Lowe's and looked up. That's typically what we mention, or what we mean when we mention. Or
if you're here in Nashville, every single restaurant ever.
Right. Absolutely. Right. Or your Walmart superstores, right? Think of your big warehouses, manufacturing facilities, those type of things. And then ceiling tile, you can envision in like maybe your home's finished basement, right? You'd kind of have a drop tile ceiling there.
Lots of office spaces tend to have them because they're good for sound absorption. So people drop those ceilings down and the tiles absorb the sound.
And to Cal's point earlier, you can run your piping, all that stuff in between the space there. But back to your point, Micah, exposed ceilings, some considerations to think about when we talk about those.
Obstructions is the biggest one that jumps out to me. If you mount it all the way at the top on the actual roof, then you often have your views obstructed by, your ductwork, your iron girders, whatever is supporting that ceiling. Sometimes you can mount to the actual support structures. I know Cal and Gil, you guys probably speak to that better than I can.
Yeah, you can mount to the joists or red bar. There's a lot of different versions up there that account for what kind of holds up a ceiling, so to speak. But remembering to drop down below for good view is the key and thing. And lighting seems to be a big problem too, because you don't want your lighting in front of a camera view. It can affect the camera picture for sure. So kind of getting an assessment of everything that's dropping down from the ceiling when you first start, you're doing your cable runs, and even when you're picturing how your cameras are going to be mounted and what they're viewing, it's going to be very important to know how far you're dropping.
And let's talk about dropping. Like, what does that actually mean? I know there's a couple different methodologies for that.
Yeah, we use we supply these like custom pendant mounts for our cameras that drop the camera. They're just basically like a piece of painted conduit that match the camera aesthetic, and they drop the cameras down. So you can mount the pendant mounts to say a joist, and then you can choose how long you want it if you want to make it custom. So you can get like a 10-foot piece of conduit and drop it all the way down 10 feet, or if you only need it down 3 feet, cut the conduit and mount it 3 feet below. Just whatever you need to get the view that you're looking for.
And our standard electrical mounting boxes are threaded in such a way that that standard rigid conduit will just thread right into the bag.
Correct.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, and it makes it easy to bring the cabling down to the camera too, because that way it's not free ran. It's kind of hidden inside either the pipe or the conduit, whatever we're using to drop the camera down to where it goes. So yeah, there's ways to feed it where the back box that's attached to the camera will feed right into the camera, and you don't see it at all. The only places you should really see cabling, obviously, if you're really looking hard and it's up there in the joist, you got to try to hide it your best that you can up there, but it's up there somewhere, and it's also going back down somewhere because it's got to connect back to wherever the head end is, MDF, IDF, wherever your switch is or your MVR is. So
what about the labor? What about the labor impact of different ways of supporting the cable on different ceiling support structures? So like extra time involved in drilling through steel beams versus other types of beams?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sometimes you have like your standard Wilson joists that they're kind of W shaped, and you can route your cable kind of through the corner of that, and so you don't really necessarily have to use any extra material other than like zip ties or something to tie it to the joist. But sometimes you have to run your cable along like beams or whatever, and so you have to attach like J hooks or something to those beams to drop the cable down. So it definitely impacts the labor time. If you have to use J hooks or something like that, it's going to take a lot more time to install those and to route the cable into those than it would be just to run your cable through the joist and attach to the joist directly.
And J hooks, like you said, bridle rings, they're all types of devices that connect in, and you will go through lots of bits on your drill when you're drilling through some of this material that's up there, because it definitely takes a toll on your equipment, but it's part of the job. It's what you do.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah. So that is, exposed ceilings to a T. What dropping a camera might mean. Why would we want to drop a camera?
To avoid obstruction of the view from a physical object or impairing the camera view because of the light, the way the light is hitting the camera itself. We see a lot of ductwork sort of camera views that have ductwork running down the sides of them, those kinds of things.
Or specific shots. You can see some really deep drops at some big warehouse stores where they're dropping down to see the what's going on the cash registers. Yeah, so I've seen like 30-foot drops. You know what I mean? It looks crazy, but it happens, and it's.
Yeah, I feel like next time you're in a Lowe's or a Walmart, if you look up, you'll see long pendants dropping down from the ceiling with a camera on it, typically a dome or something like that.
Right.
And that is absolutely all correct. And what I was getting at there is height of ceiling. Most exposed ceilings are extraordinarily tall, much taller than your traditional drop tile ceiling might be. And so dropping a camera will help lower that camera down into the field of view that you're.
So you're not just getting the tops of people's heads.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
But with exposed ceilings, there's a lot of things to consider there. That's awesome. So let's dive into the other ceiling type that's most commonly found, ceiling tiles. And most people would think of a ceiling tile and a camera or any other physical security equipment and think, oh, I can just mount to the tile and pop it back in there. But it's not that easy, right?
No.
Don't look at historical SCW guides on mounting to ceiling tiles. They are wrong.
There's an asterisk. We stand corrected. We've learned from our mistakes. No, absolutely. I'm sure Gil, Cal, Mike, you can all dive in here.
Yeah, I mean, with ceiling tiles, the one thing to take into account as far as code goes is you need to have like a point of contact from the camera or the camera mounting box to the actual structure. So say you have your ceiling tile and you have your camera that's mounted sitting inside the ceiling tile so you can see what's going on below the ceiling tile. On the back of the ceiling tile, the unexposed side, you need to have some sort of like enclosure for the connection point from the cabling to the camera. So your termination is enclosed. And then that enclosure that's attached to the ceiling tile needs to be attached to the actual ceiling grid that the tile is sitting in. And the back of the electrical mounting box that's attached to the ceiling tile needs to be attached with like grid wire. It's just like small, this metal wire that they use to hold the ceiling grids up.
Yeah, it's aluminum wire. Yeah.
Yeah, aluminum wire. You can attach that to the beams or the joists above, so the camera's supported. If it just falls out of the ceiling tile, it won't drop and hurt someone. It'll be supported and hang there.
Yeah. And go ahead. I'm sorry, Micah.
I would just say you
Cut
can buy
video
some
over.
of these like mounting kits, so to speak, prefabricated to make it a little bit easier. It adds a little bit of cost, but it means you're not having to source all the individual parts and pieces.
Yeah, it's all about support, obviously. There's different ways. Cal pretty much gave the best way to do it. But, I've seen, you could cut a piece of plywood and put it up there and mount the camera to it. And it helps spread the weight out, basically. And it's effective and it works. Will it pass code on a new instruction? Probably not. But you can do it on probably a retrofit. What Cal basically explained is probably the best way for any new construction to do it, for sure. But there's other codes we have to remember too, because remember, once we have a drop ceiling tile in and there's space between the drop ceiling tile and the actual ceiling, we got to plan on return. So we got an air return issue, right?
Mhm.
So what's the big deal about that, right? Well, Micah, tell us what the big deal is.
It all has to do with not dying of hazardous fumes in a fire,
That's
essentially.
exactly right.
That's it.
Yeah, if a space is being used for air return, you have to put cable in it that is going to basically not kill you as it melts. So you need
Mhm.
quote unquote plenum rated cable, which does add some extra expense. Now, a drop ceiling is not necessarily a plenum space if it's not being used for air return, right, Gil? But
That's correct.
frequently they are.
But how can you tell?
Is there enclosed
Sometimes you
ductwork?
can't.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can't. So you're better safe than sorry, and you just better go with the plain cable. I don't know, Cal, have you ever run into this? Because there's also situations where they require other things up there in the ceiling to be plenum rated, which means like back boxes and things like that. You ever ran into that?
Yeah. And kind of, let's see, like hospitals, that's probably the most common space that I've run into stuff like that.
Yeah.
And also too, like with buildings like hospitals, that sometimes they have a different ceiling type, which is called an interstitial ceiling type. And that's like an area in between the drop ceiling and the floor of the next ceiling. It's kind of the same premises as a suspended ceiling, but it's a little bit bigger of a space. And usually those spaces are used for air return. Sometimes they're big enough to where you can get up there and walk around in between floors. It's pretty crazy.
Very good point. Yep.
And usually those spaces are used for air return, so they are plenum spaces.
That brings
Very
up a good
good.
point. That's
Yeah.
awesome. And before we segue to any other ceiling type, finish off on ceiling tiles, those are some of the main concerns. Would we recommend typically mounting to a ceiling tile? There's plenty of applications where we would. I
Oh
think.
yeah,
Oh, yeah.
absolutely.
It's not about not mounting to the ceiling tile. It's about the ceiling tile itself, that plasticky grid not being what's supporting the weight of the camera.
Beautiful. Perfect.
I will say there are cameras that can be mounted directly to a ceiling tile. They are light enough and small enough.
Yes.
If
to be
you look
supported.
up the specs on the actual ceiling tile, that'll tell you the weight considerations. Is that right, Gil?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then
that's true.
aren't there
Um,
some special type of fancy mounting kit you can use, like a ceiling tile mounting?
Yeah, I mean, if you
Product,
literally
right?
Google ceiling tile mounting kit,
Yeah, there's a
Amazon has
bunch.
them. There's tons of options.
Yeah, they sell them at most of you like electricians, they're like the experts at this stuff. So they have stuff like that. People that put in fire alarm systems, that's another big one.
Mhm.
Because they're putting a lot of devices up on the ceiling, and if they're actually doing sprinkler systems, they're cutting into tiles a lot too. So they're very familiar with that kind of stuff. So any distribution that helps those trades along with us, they're going to have ample devices to help with these situations for sure.
Awesome. That's perfect. That puts a bow in ceiling tiles. That's great. So exposed ceilings, ceiling tiles, probably the two most common that we see. Another common one though that we run into often, at least SCW we run into because we work with a lot of houses of worship, would be plaster or hard ceilings.
The dreaded hard lid.
Yeah, I
Fixed
didn't almost want to bring it
ceiling.
up, but you know, woo-wee.
That's the worst.
Gotta talk about it,
Yes, we do.
Why is it the worst, Gil?
Because you got to crawl up above it, and you got to make sure it can hold your weight.
I know.
There's a lot of stuff to be careful of up there. It's not a situation where you can just peek your head up and look and see what's above that, like a drop ceiling tile or an exposed ceiling. You just look. You got no idea. So you actually kind of got to go up and check it out. And you don't know what's going on up there. And you don't know if it's really a false, it's like there's false hard ceilings where they're just made of plaster. They're just made of drop ceiling, or of drywall, you know? And one step on them and you're right through them. It's hard to tell until you're actually up there really looking at it and walking around and seeing what you can step on versus what you can't. Very important.
Yeah. And that brings up a good point about hard ceilings is that, even accessing them to where you can see inside is, sometimes part of the battle.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. Sometimes, you have a point of egress or something really important that you want to put a camera on that ceiling to be able to see, but there's no access to that hard ceiling in that particular area. So, I mean, sometimes you have to get really crafty and cut your own access hatches and install access hatches so you can take a look up there and route the cable and be able to fish the cable to the camera location. Sometimes it's hard ceilings make things very, very difficult. Add a lot of labor as well.
Do you want to speak to what you do with a hard ceiling if you can't get access, if you can't route the cable above it?
Well, I mean, we
end up using like Panduit sometimes, and
we ran into this,
that.
and you offer those solutions. A lot of it's going to be surface mount solutions that you offer. So you say Panduit, which is like a plastic thin conduit, for
wire
people.
mold.
Yeah, wire mold, very good. Stuff like that that's going to be exposed or something that people can see. Then it's really up to the customer if they want that. They have to make that decision. We've had a project here locally where there was no access. No access that we could get was either cut in or exposed. And they weren't having it. And they just said, you know what, we're just not going to put cameras up in this area. So it's really up to the owner's discretion, but Cal probably has some other examples of that too.
Not off the top of my head. You kind of put me on the spot.
No, I'll tap in there. No, I think, hospitality, think of hotels, vestibule areas, lobby areas,
or historical buildings sometimes.
Historical buildings, absolutely.
Churches.
Churches, all these things.
We could do a whole session on churches.
We could.
And then residential structures, which we're not really covering in this, but pretty much every residential structure that you deal with is going to have
every single one.
Every one of them.
And the tough part is when you have multi-level. So you may have a ceiling here, and then it goes to a big exposed room. And then you have other ceilings on the other side. And it's like, okay, how am I getting through the big exposed room to the other side if that's where I gotta go? So
those vaulted ceilings, or what are they called, tray ceilings, the ones that have those are very, very hard to deal with. Sometimes let's see, recently I did a house. There's like a really, really large house, like a 7-bedroom house, and they had, I think, 4 different attics that were all at 4 different levels to account for the vaulted ceilings. So you have to go from one attic to another attic to another attic, and then you usually try to follow the chimney down to the basement where you can route your cabling. It's just hard ceilings and tray ceilings, vaulted ceilings, they make things very difficult.
And this is all, leaning toward making sure that when you're designing the system and coming up with your scope of work, you got to do a lot of homework ahead of time, because you don't want any of this to bite you know where, because it will. If you don't get up there and get into it to figure out what exactly is around, where your paths are and what's up there, you got no chance of having a successful project.
Absolutely. That's why at SCW, we would recommend having someone on the facilities team or someone that is, has a knowledge of the facility to be on the call with one of the consultants designing the scope for these reasons, right? Understanding what type of ceiling types you have, what might be running where, all of these things. Gil mentioned a good point too about multi-level and the change of different ceiling types. That's a factor, right? In some buildings, in some situations where ceiling types change in height drastically, there's firewalls that now need to be penetrated, and there's a multitude of different complications.
More code issues right there dealing with firewalls, because you better get those right, because if someone inspects and they're wrong, there's going to be trouble coming.
Yeah, that's when you get into the above ceiling work permits. As soon as you start dealing and penetrating with firewalls, it's absolutely necessary that you pull an above ceiling work permit.
Absolutely.
So yeah, if you have any of those complexities and you're not sure exactly where to go or who to turn to, SCW offers full turnkey solution. SCW offers total turnkey installation services. We'd be happy to help, and we handle these type of complexities all the time. Feel free to reach out.
Absolutely, for sure.
So that covers the major ceiling types. Let's go back to and talk about what type of cameras we would recommend mounting to different ceilings. So we covered a little bit with drop tile in mentioning that there's some smaller profile, lower profile, lighter cameras that might work.
Yeah, I guess with our camera line, it would be like the informant and the deputy. Those are probably what I'd recommend for ceiling tiles, and the sheriff as well. Any kind of dome or turret cameras.
Of course, you have the radiuses.
Yeah, the radius. Also, the fisheye cameras would be perfect for a higher ceiling, so you can get a good field of view of the entire room.
We joked in the beginning about small and light, but you can mount a lot of different types of cameras, and if you really want a PTZ indoor, which people do, and you can do it, and handheld zoom camera for anyone that's wondering. But you just need to make sure that you're supporting it properly. That's all. I mean, it supports the key. You can put anything you want. You can install anything you want as long as it's supported properly. That's all.
That's right. Absolutely. And just be sure you're, paying attention to the different options that you have available to you, right? There's different PTZ models for different applications.
Right.
Garrison would be a good example of a PTZ model we would want to use indoors in a drop tile situation.
Absolutely.
Whereas like a Lookout 2.0 or a Scope certainly would not.
Right.
That's pretty clear. Micah mentioned earlier.
I mean, if your definition of indoor is an airplane hangar, then it might be appropriate, but outside of that.
Right. Well, I was actually just going to segue and say that, Micah, you mentioned earlier that dome cameras are typically what we see mounted to ceilings, just generally, because most of the time ceilings are indoors and dome cameras usually work best. But Gil, Cal, Micah, we've all been a part of projects where we mounted other types of cameras besides dome cameras to the ceilings. Anything jump out or come to mind?
I mean, some of it is what field of view you're looking for. If you're looking down an aisle and you're not actually going to get the benefit of the more expansive field of view that you usually have with a turret or a dome, a bullet can be the right choice because you're going to get a little bit farther, because as you narrow, you get more distance. So that can be a better use of sort of those variables. What else comes to mind for you guys?
Yeah, like you said, warehouses, like any kind of application where you're going to have like shelving or that create the aisles, like you said. That's one of the big ones that jumps out, where you're going to use a bullet indoors. And an airplane hanger. I've actually done a couple of airplane hangers as well. Those, you can mount whatever kind of cameras you want in those ceilings. They're high enough.
Definitely. I'm thinking of a logistics client that we have locally, where we have some larger PTZ models indoors for them to zoom around and look at different loading bays, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, and we see radiuses as well. I mean, those are those are pretty frequently, we have one in our demo that you can see in our office because it gives a really good sort of 360. If you have a wide area, you lose a little bit of detail sometimes. It kind of depends on how far down it is or how, I guess, how high it's mounted. But you cover a lot more territory with only one camera. So there are times where that's a good choice as well.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Definitely.
You also, the other thing you want to keep in mind, especially back in the open ceiling arena, is that, you know, lots of times you have to consider what it's going to take to service some of this stuff. And remember, a lot of times it's probably going to take requiring a lift to install them.
Mhm.
When I lift, I mean like a scissor lift, even a boom lift at times. Just to run the cable. Sometimes you can get to the camera without a lift, but you need a lift to run the cable. But these are all considerations that have to be made when you're installing stuff like that, because stuff will go wrong. Things will happen. Cameras aren't perfect, and they do go out, or anything can cause you to have to troubleshoot. And if you have to get up there and troubleshoot, think about how the easiest way you're going to do that down the road while you're installing the system.
Absolutely. It's a really great point, Gil. Appreciate you bringing it up. Absolutely. That's why a lot of this planning needs to be done ahead of time. A lot of these considerations need to be thought of and why we make the videos that we make. So absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think that about does it. That covers the ceiling types, the main ones that we see a majority of the time and interact with, some of the obstacles, how we tackle those obstacles, and then different cameras we might use in different applications. I really appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you so much for everyone's input. There's going to be a ton of links to some of the products, some of the resources that we have on our website below in the description. So be sure to check those out. If you have any comments or feedback, leave them below as well. Until next time, thanks so much for tuning in.
All right, gang.
Bye.
See ya.